Okay, I think we can get started. I want to say thank you for everyone. Thanks for coming to our session about investigating social media. Really appreciate everyone checking it out. So, the idea when I called together this panel was essentially a realization I came to a number of years ago, which is basically like the internet of 5 years ago, if you think about what that internet was and how it was structured, and compare it to like the conception of what that is now, especially of the dominant institutions, kind of for-profit social media institutions, is really different. And to me, that was kind of striking. Like 5 years ago, it felt, at least to me, like the companies that basically ran the social fabric of the internet were pretty set in their ways. And this was the reality we were going to be living with. And now I think we're in a period of flux, and you have Facebook, which has pivoted so hard into virtual reality that it's no longer even called Facebook in a way anymore. You have TikTok going from this app for lip syncing teens to this really dominant social media force, and you have Twitter doing I just whatever is just however Elon Musk is feeling that particular hour. And so I wanted to bring together a bunch of people who have really thought about these institutions a lot and looked into them and studied them in a way that I think would be really helpful for journalists and people who just live on the internet. To help us all kind of understand what it is that these companies are doing, and also for people who are researching and looking into these companies and trying to hold them accountable, trying to provide some advice or tips or ideas about ways to do that in a more effective way. So I am really thankful that this fantastic panel has agreed to chat about all this cool stuff with me. First we have Joan Donovan, the research director of Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She leads the field in examining internet and technology studies.
I love compliments. So
the absolute goat. Big fan. Happy to be sitting next to me.
The only thing you need to know about my bio is that I co-created the beaver emoji. Everything else, paperwork.
Yes.
Okay,
And you're not even Canadian.
This panel has pivoted entirely. We are talking about emojis. Next we have Isobel Cockerell, a senior reporter at Coda Story, covering disinformation, the war on science, and authoritarian technology. And finally, we have Mathew Ingram, the chief digital writer. Everyone gets claps. And finally, Mathew Ingram, the chief digital writer for Columbia Journalism Review, where he frequently chronicles the ever-evolving relationship between technology and capital T, capital M, the media. So,
I invented the poop emoji.
So I think the goal here, we can share a little bit about what we've learned and about covering these institutions, and then at the end, we're going to save 10, 15 minutes for questions from y'all to hopefully elucidate some questions that you might have. So I'll start with Joan. So from your post at Harvard, you've been part of the Facebook Archive project, which is an effort that is aimed at taking this giant trove of documents leaked by former Meta employee Frances Haugen and making them more widely available. And in embarking on that project, I'm curious what going through all of those documents has taught you about how the company operates internally, and what lessons you would say those insights could teach journalists or researchers or other people interested in understanding the company, how to understand it a little better.
yeah, so just by way of transparency, so the fbarchive.org is a project that I'm running with LaTanya Sweeney, who's a data scientist at Harvard as well, and she has tenure. We came across the documents independently, but at one point I was probably the only researcher in the world that had seen them outside of journalists and Congress members and staffers. And I looked at the documents and I thought, wow, here we finally have proof that Facebook knows what the rest of us knows, which is that the product is the problem. that the thing that they produce causes harm in all of these different ways. This was around the time that the Wall Street Journal stories had started breaking, particularly around teens and Instagram. But by and large, the story of the Facebook archive and these documents, why they're important is because Frances thought a lot about what she would search for. She had access to all kinds of different documents across Facebook because she was part of this civic integrity team. And she took picture files. So imagine 20,000 image files that are not set up to search, and so we had to do a fair amount of cleaning to make the documents privacy protected so that, employees' names are not visible, as well as usernames are not visible. But what you learn when you go through these documents and the research from Facebook about Facebook is that they're really working ad hoc to implement policy. And what you learn, I teach at a policy school, so Harvard Kennedy School is a policy school, and policies are often difficult to enforce. They're almost like an ideal type in the sense that if everything works perfectly, then the policy can be applied. But when you have something like a product that is Facebook, policies can't be applied evenly because the scale is just so large. So in effect, what you learn is that they rely heavily on outsiders to flag content to make these connections, which has changed research about platforms entirely from a field of, like the Association of Internet Researchers, people doing pretty banal research about link sharing and habits online, to actually looking and delving deeper into the design of the platforms themselves. And you learn that someone like Zuckerberg or Sandberg are the highest paid content moderators in the biz, because they are the ones that make the final decisions on anybody or anything that might be influential, including the president of the United States. And so what the documents really reveal is that Facebook doesn't really know how to do content moderation. And so it's opened up a new set of research questions, essentially, which we're hoping in June, when we give access to people to the platform where we're hosting all the documents and they're going to be searchable, we're hoping that reporters and researchers make collections out of that and try to make sense of things like elections in Brazil or incitement during January 6th. Because it's not just enough to know what Facebook knew at the time. It's also important to cross-check and think about, well, what are the other forms of evidence that journalists have spent and researchers have spent the last few years collecting, collating, and making sense of, and using these documents to back it up. And then the last thing I'll say about it is it teaches us a lot about what happens in news deserts. So there is a pretty interesting correlation between places that have lost local news coverage and the amount of Facebook community groups that have been formed. So it's not the case that people aren't in search of local information, but that is shifted. And it should give some entrepreneurial excitement to news reporters and people who are interested in local information sharing, because you do see that there's quite a bit of excitement around these local groups. And I always do this thing where I say the last thing and then I add another thing. So as a moderator, check me on that. But the other last thing I would say is particular the kinds of fields that I study, which is mostly the far right. And in particular, what you learn, and this has been reported on by Craig Silverman as well as Ryan Mack, that they knew quite a bit about how their tools are used to incite people. And they knew quite a bit about January 6th, which groups were being animated. They knew quite a bit about how their own products were being weaponized to undermine U.S. democracy, and how people are using their tools to get organized, not just to say, be at this certain place at a certain time. People were using their groups and instant messages and whatnot to arrange rides, to share resources, to arrange hotel rooms and whatnot. And so just as we might study these platforms and the rise of social movements in 2011 around Occupy, or I know Courtney has studied quite a bit about Facebook and the so-called Arab Spring in the MENA region. But what you learn is that it took the far right a little bit of time to catch up and learn how to use these tools. And now they use them like most ordinary social movements, except the content is genocide. Right? The content is discrimination. The content is hate, harassment, and incitement. Now, I don't know of any product in the world that's allowed to do that without accountability. And so what the next phase of this research really has to look at is who are the actors, what are the behaviors, what's the content, A, B, C, and then D. You got to go deep on design, which is why I'm happy to be here with someone from the Markup who I think does exquisite work on interrogating the design of these platforms. Because if we don't get at that big question of the information distribution and unequal access to the truth, we're going to enter into a situation where people are voting against their best interest, taking in information that is hoaxes, grifts, lies, and taking action based on that. And I do believe that January 6th was a bit of a beta test to see how the corporations would respond and if they would restrict access to people. And by and large, what you learn from the Facebook papers is they knew what was happening, but they didn't have the tools or the insight to stop it, even though their platforms were aiding in the scale of this kind of insurrectionary activity. And that's the last thing.
Well, one thing, Joan, you said that really struck me is that the Facebook leaks, they showed us that Facebook knows what we all know. Like, there's no secret view that Facebook has that, negates the view of the average user. And that feels, for people who are covering and trying to research, that feels like profoundly important. To say that you as a user of this platform, like, you should believe your eyes, like what you are seeing is real and what you are seeing is probably happening at scale. And I wonder if you could talk about that, and please, anyone, like, jump in. I feel like you can talk. I'd be interested to get a sense of what you think that lesson shows for people who are trying to understand this, and like, if the ability of folks trying to understand it using their own kind of personal experience as a lens is maybe a little more validated than, I think companies might like.
I mean, there's not a lot you can't see on these platforms that has to do with, ethnographic experience, right? Not necessarily experiencing it as a personal user who's like, oh, I got kids and I got to plan this birthday party and I'm going to have this Facebook event page, right? You kind of have to experience it in a much broader form, either from the point of view of an activist or the point of view of someone who is victimized, and that's where interviewing becomes such an important tool of journalists to talk to people about how they got information. One of the best lines in Kelly Wheel's book, Over the Edge, about flat earthers, is she's interviewing someone and he just says, I didn't search for flat earth, it found me. And so he was into conspiracy theories and he was totally okay with all kinds of heinous content on YouTube, but he had never thought about flat earth until it got recommended to him. So auditing recommendation systems, talking to people that have had these experiences, all of this over time adds up to patterns. I wasn't surprised when Facebook realized, oh, this tool that we built for business insights, CrowdTangle, it can also show all these other things that are bad patterns in the data. Let's pretend it doesn't exist.
Joan, you mentioned that oftentimes it's people who find things and then tell Facebook about it. people are doing the moderating, and I know in a number of cases, journalists have found things and then asked Facebook about it, and then it disappears. Because, of course, Facebook, we didn't even know that was happening, so thanks for letting us know, and we'll just delete it and pretend that it never happened.
Yeah, they just play that game of guacamole.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Whack-a-mole, exactly.
Yeah, and I would say, like, personal story, like, I had spent a few years ago was doing some research on Facebook of, like, COVID conspiracy groups, literally just typing COVID conspiracy into the group search, and there were a lot of them that have that name. And then I started getting ads for literal tinfoil hats, like literally like a beanie with tinfoil in
You
it.
can make your own.
I think the Facebook, all of the social media platforms algorithms, because I just use my personal account, which is very unprofessional, but the algorithm has no idea who I am or what. It's like one week I'm a QAnon adherent, next week I'm like a human trafficker. It's a total disaster.
So Isobel, you're a writer on the Infodemic newsletter, and a lot of your beat is covering disinformation and conspiracy theories as they flow across the internet. Can you talk a little bit about one of those kind of conspiracy narratives or disinformation narratives that you followed that you think is important, and kind of like what the process of that reporting on that is like, and like what it's maybe taught you?
I mean, I just want to reflect what Joan said as well. Like, certainly, when it comes to the algorithm kind of feeding you content, you don't necessarily even already need to be in that conspiracy mindset. Like, a lot of people who found anti-vax conspiracies were just like young mothers who had had their first child and were looking up about vaccines when it came to inoculating their first child, and then were immediately fed this stuff. And then they often get a lot of the blame because it's like, well, why are you searching for these things on Facebook? Like, you should just not use Facebook. But that's not really an adequate answer for them, I don't think. But I guess I'd like to kind of tell a story about my experience with Meta and Instagram and Facebook in two parts. It's a story in two parts. But it starts in early 2020 when Soleimani was killed by a US drone strike. And what we saw immediately was that Iranians were using Instagram, which is an incredibly important platform in Iran. At that point, it wasn't controlled by the IRGC, and it was one of the only ways that people could kind of, in a more unfiltered way, discuss politics, and journalists used it a lot. And what we quickly saw was that anyone posting about Soleimani in any way across the political spectrum, when they used certain keywords, I think Soleimani was one, but their account was frozen and they were kicked off the platform, or their account was suspended, or they were locked out. And we kind of noticed this immediately. I think about 15 journalists reported this happening, but I think in the end it was probably in the hundreds. Also activists, people in the diaspora as well, not in Iran, who were having their accounts blocked. And this was my first real run-in, I think, with Meta as a company and like the way that their comms worked. And, you know, at one point, journalists were coming to me and like, I wrote the story, and Meta basically just said, like, we can't allow people posting in praise of Soleimani at all, and so we're operating under US sanctions, and we're wiping their accounts. But whenever I flagged certain accounts to them, say journalists, I flagged maybe a dozen accounts to them, they were like, oh, well, these, we do realize we've made a mistake with these, and we'll unblock these. And so then it got to the point after I published the piece, and it was picked up a lot around the world, and a lot of journalists started reaching out to me, being like, please, can you help me get my account back? So then it became like I was almost like this liaison officer between Meta and these journalists, and I was like, and then it became this weird relationship where they were just, spot shutting down the accounts that I flagged to them. And I was like, well, I can't continue this relationship. This isn't my job. My job is to expose the system that's at fault here, and my job is to report on it. It's not to act as your personal liaison officer. And I think, it's like, kind of speaks to what you said. It's like they knew what was happening, but they didn't have the tools to change it, or they didn't care enough to change it. I don't know, but they didn't change it across the board. They would just spot change what we flagged to them, and that's kind of what you were saying as well. They just wipe the issue, the specific issue you flagged, and then continue on their way. And we saw that again when the Ukraine invasion started, and we reported on how news organizations in Georgia and Ukraine were seeing 90% of their audiences just disappear on Facebook. And Facebook is an incredibly important tool in those countries. And it was happening, we think, because Russian interested troll farms were mass reporting these accounts, but also because they were just using keywords like Zelensky, and it was being flagged as terrorism. And so, again, when we went to Facebook, we actually received some quite bizarre, off-the-record kind of DMs, being like, we're doing our best, but why are you're not helping, you're not helping the people you claim to be helping. You're just, and like, why are you doing this, basically? And that's something that I think maybe you can speak to as well, is like these personal appeals from the people within the platforms.
Yeah, I've gotten those as well.
I've had it from Amazon too, like a phone called, please don't.
Stop doing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're hurting us.
You're hurting me in my job. And yeah, it was interesting. And the same kind of issue came up again, where it was like, it's again not our job to, highlight and fix individual problems. It's our job to write about the system. But it was interesting the way, in both cases, a similar thing happened where we became these kind of go-betweens between these journalists who are being censored and...
Yeah, I often get people ask me, "Hey, can you get my account back?"
Yeah,
like, I don't.
me too.
I don't work there.
If you're a journalist, that's one of the most common. A family member will say, "I can't get into my Instagram."
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how. I can't help you. Like,
Yeah,
I don't
but I
have
think it
personal
speaks to a
contact.
larger problem where they have all these policies, but they don't know how to enforce them. And
Well, and they don't publicize them either. Like
No,
a lot of
they
them are
don't.
secret.
Yeah, but also I think it shows us that there's a lot of digital shenanigans going on, especially, not a big fan of the Twitter files, but some of the stuff that has been revealed is quite unnerving, especially about the relationship between Twitter and the FBI. And, unfortunately, if it weren't for and this is not funny, but these journalists that are on it are incredibly partisan. And so we can't trust what we see because we know it's got a slant. But what we do see is that, at least in part, and this had only been rumor until it was confirmed, that the U.S. is operating information operations through Twitter, especially in the MENA region, and had asked to make sure that their accounts got whitelisted.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that kind of journalism is really important, especially when we start to look at, well, what is the purpose of the internet? It's a global information commons. And if it's going to operate like a commons, we have to think about it as an issue of access, issues of transparency. If someone's advertising to you, we should know. There shouldn't be an internet beat where people have to uncover who's behind the new set of, Klobuchar,
But it's not a commons.
anti-Klobuchar
It's a shopping mall, and it's controlled by private enterprise. And so,
Not everywhere.
well, not everywhere, but lots of the most important places people go.
Yeah, I was talking more aspirationally
Yeah,
about
no, I
where we
agree.
began.
I agree.
Where we've ended up, yes, is more like the Dave Chappelle version of the shopping mall, where you can go to the porn store and then you can go get all your MP3s.
Well, not only that, they can kick you out if you're waving a flag in the middle of the concourse because they control it.
Yeah, no, and I think that control is it's exacerbated by the way I think press went on social media. It wasn't the case that social media designed these products for the press. Press repurposed these products in order to serve up the news. And I do think that there needs to be more heavy emphasis on what social media's design doesn't do for society, or what I call the true costs of misinformation at scale. By way of hands, how many of you have had to write a story debunking some kind of misinformation? That's a good chunk of you. You could have written a story about climate change. You could have written a story about, bumblebees and
Or celebrities.
celebrities, what have you. But it is a drain on the on the resources of newsrooms to have to keep going in and debunking, to have to keep going in and saying these are real journalists that you're deplatforming, which is to say that I think the bigger overarching story, especially going into 2024 where we have 70 different elections, has to be the way these platforms are used by other governments, the way they're used by dark money political operatives, and then the way that they're used to foment hate, harassment, and incitement. I know there's at least a dozen panels on harassment of journalists. The point is silence or violence, right? It's either to shut you up or to make you so fearful of getting hurt that you don't tell the story. You don't want to report on women's reproductive rights because it's dangerous. Even in the field of disinformation, they're trying to get us shut up in different ways. It's no mistake that Musk has laid off a ton of people in research. Facebook has laid off 21,000 people. Google and Jigsaw have laid off a bunch of people, many of which are tasked with taking on political lies.
Yeah, I think Twitter laid off its entire trust and safety team. So I guess there's no more trust or safety.
Well, that should have always been called the human rights violations. But,
And I think to that point of, to the Joan, what you were saying is like, there is, the way that the news media has functioned on these social platforms is largely a function of the social platforms themselves, meaning that reporters could be reporting on Twitter, news organizations could be reporting on Twitter, but they are also Twitter users. Like, they're still just users, so they have to conform to the norms of that. So I was curious, like, Mathew, if you could talk a little bit about this relationship that journalists and news outlets have with these social media platforms, because, news outlets use social media platforms for distribution. They use it for brand identity. They use it for all of these things, but at the same time, they're also critically covering these institutions. So I think, there's that tension of those two things. And as these institutions in a lot of ways have evolved, in post Elon Musk Twitter, when reporters send a question, they just get an auto response poop emoji back.
That really boils down the press.
Yeah, which they should be paying you for that.
That really boils down the press relationship to its ultimate, I send a question, I get a poop emoji. That's
but it's actually not that different. Like actual interactions.
No, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Exactly
so it's actually Elon has just simplified it to the point where you realize exactly what's going on. Before you would just get a long sort of form response that was meaningless. Now you just get a poop emoji. They're the same thing in a way. Yeah, they both don't work and they don't answer your question.
But is it also kind of in a way that a journalist goes to a company, any institution, and says, I think I found you doing something wrong and I would like a comment. And it seems like, at least to me, the motivation they have for responding is maybe we can make this story look a little less bad for us if they bring it in. And does it seem like, in a sense, being more hostile to that means that they just don't care about that? And how as a journalist would you say, especially if what you're going for is accountability, to try to take the bad things you see and try to shame the people who have power into doing something about it? How do you kind of deal with that?
Definitely with Twitter, for example, under Musk, there's no longer even the illusion that he cares, or that the management of Twitter cares. Before, I think they also didn't care, but they kind of disguised that, cared about anything other than growing Twitter and selling ads and making money. They sort of notionally cared about freedom of information way back in the sort of Ev Williams and Jack Dorsey days, but that quickly disappeared as they grew larger and larger. Now Elon Musk, I don't think is even pretending that he cares about journalism he cares about the kind of journalism that he likes and the people who write things like the Twitter files, but he doesn't care about it in a broader sense, and it appears that it's just, he spent $44 billion for a plaything, a thing that he could sort of fool around with and have fun with. And so when journalists bring things up, it's not just that he argues sort of rationally that they're wrong or that he has some argument, it's the poop emoji. So it's literally, I'm not even going to give what you're talking about enough sort of credence to give you a response, even if it's a PR kind of thing that means nothing. I'm just literally going to ignore you. And a lot of the things that I think journalists have been pointing out as being bad, he actually thinks is good. So distortion, you name it, sort of right-wing accounts that traffic in the worst kind of stuff being given highlighted on Twitter and their accounts restored. He actually thinks those things are good. So if you're a journalist, Twitter was always hard to understand and to sort of, there were people on various teams that you could talk with. I think the sort of overarching problem, and this goes for Facebook too in a way, is Twitter had no idea what it was doing for a long time. And I would argue even the founders had no clue what it was Twitter was for, what it was doing, what it should be doing. There was just this kind of, they created a tool, people grabbed it and did things with it, and they kind of scrambled to sort of get used to that. And Mark Zuckerberg thought Facebook was a great way for people to connect, and that was objectively good. And I don't think he even thought about, what if those people are bad, and what if the things they're connecting about are bad? To be honest, I don't think that even occurred to him.
And it kind of makes me think of, there was a report that Twitter put out a few years ago that was like, they were talking about, they had done kind of some internal research, and it said, they had found of just weighing kind of, like more left-wing liberal content versus more right-wing conservative content, that it's like, the report said their system, they found, tends to kind of privilege like more conservative far-right content. And the thing that really struck me is rare for like a social media company, is they were like, we don't really know why. They were like, it's that, and like we don't totally know why. And like assuming that was like accurate, that struck me as like almost like a point of vulnerability and like a point of like trust of like, okay, you're trying to grapple with this just like we do.
A point of honesty that's rare, because they like to pretend that they understand how all the levers and dials affect things. But I think honestly, the scale of it is just impossible to comprehend. So if you're...
Well, this has a lot to do with the technical relationship between different audiences. So right-wing media audiences, so if you read, there's a great book by Yukai Benkler and Rob Ferris, who works with me, called Network Propaganda. And the right wing is just a different news animal from center and left. So the right wing tends to share stories that are not covered in the center or left. So if you were to go on right-wing Twitter right now, everything is about denigrating trans people and Bud Light being, so terrible as a corporation so as to make, sponsor one trans influencer that apparently nobody can drink the beer anymore. That's not really even covered on center or left media. It's not even a story. But on the right wing, you would think this is the most important thing that has ever happened in the history of politics. And so right-wing sharing patterns are very different from center and left. And this goes back to the origins of some of these platforms. YouTube used to be, well, at first it was a dating site, but then it became this broadcast yourself, be the media type of platforms. And you saw a lot of citizen journalists, early online news organizations, especially around the time of Occupy, who were also anti-mainstream media, pick up social media and share a lot. And then on the left, you had these concepts of slacktivism or clicktivism. Now imagine if the left were more like the right, because the right sees information suppression as their number one political participatory mechanism. So not just voting, not going out and screaming at whatever city hall. The mechanism of engagement on the right is sharing stories.
Are you
sharing
saying they're
news.
better at it than the left?
Oh, they're so much better at it. They're so much coordinated, so much more coordinated.
Because they're more impassioned.
Because, well,
Based
first
on
off,
empathetic left.
everything is free. Okay, there's no subscriptions, there's no paywalls. YouTube privileges Fox News in their recommendations because they got complained at so much by the right that most of your recommendations, if you're looking at a popular news story, are going to go to Fox News, and that's because it's less extreme, quote unquote.
They have
than the
done a
rest.
very good job, the right, of convincing people that the platforms are biased against them, which
Which motivates
there's
sharing.
literally no evidence that that's true.
No, the evidence points the other
The
way,
opposite,
but
yeah.
they're this victimized mentality and this
Yeah.
idea about sharing suppressed information so that everybody knows is a political engagement, not a business relationship. Nobody's like, such an avid fan of MSNBC that they're like, I gotta share all these stories, right?
And I don't think it's really the topic of this panel, but what you suggested is a lot of subscription sites have high quality, sort of possibly left-leaning information. All the free stuff is right-wing.
Right.
It's
So
always
if-
free.
if you
because
don't
it's
wanna pay,
not news.
You get right-wing conspiracy theories.
I'm curious, though, about your guys' experience monitoring disinformation in the days of Elon Musk. Certainly for us, we monitor every day, disinformation patterns, and suddenly Twitter has become like a very much more useful tool in a way because you can just...
Because it's a garbage
There
fire.
it is.
Yeah.
You don't need to find it anymore. You don't need to go, down into the kind of undergrowth.
I mean,
It's all
Elon
served up right there with your breakfast.
Elon
It's
Musk
great
is
for us,
is the
but-
biggest troll on that service.
Right.
And we know that he got his engineers to architect the algorithm to promote his stuff more
Yeah.
because he was upset that his tweet about the Super Bowl or whatever didn't get as many likes as, Joe Biden's.
Well, I want to push back a little bit on Musk's motivation to buy Twitter because I do think he's a political animal, and I do think that he bought Twitter because he wanted to be, exactly like
Yeah.
you say, more socially relevant. But he comes from this very same background of these far right, more far right than conservative anti-media factions online. So if you look at the places and spaces that he pulls his memes from, for example, they come from Reddit.
Yep.
And they come from 4chan.
See, I'm not disagreeing with you, but it feels to me more like he's playing with that stuff than, like, I think he's your classic kind of Reddit troll guy who hangs out in forums, and I'm not convinced he actually believes any of these things deeply. I think
I think he bought Twitter to upset mainstream media. I think he bought
It's working.
that early version of that night on Twitter Spaces where he had kicked off a bunch of WAPO and New York Times journalists, and then he came into the Twitter Spaces, and I was one of the co-moderators, and we're all like, "Are we gonna put him on?" And we did, and he basically said journalists don't get any privileges here.
Right.
And then he shut
then he
down
shut it
Twitter
down, yeah.
Spaces.
In fact, he shut
completely.
down all Twitter Spaces,
Yeah.
not just that one.
I'm curious too about. I think it's trying not to pathologize like a specific social media owner, but I think one of the things that always really struck me about Musk and current Twitter that I think is fundamentally like kind of different than I think how other social media companies are governed, which is that like it seems like it's governed like Elon Musk is first and foremost like a poster. That dude loves to post.
Yeah.
And it's run by a mechanism that I think that is very similar, more similar to the way that users use that.
Yeah,
Then I'd see like Facebook is like you see, the leadership of Facebook, they're like Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook posts do not look like a super normal Facebook post. They're very like manicured and corporate. So I was curious like if you think that like there is a difference or, if it matters that when a social media company is kind of governed in a way where like the idea of how it is governed is like common to the user base as opposed to governed in a way that like is by management administering a system. If that question makes sense.
In sociology we do when we look at corporations or social movements. You look at the what's called organizational culture, and leadership makes a huge difference in the terms, especially if I don't think of social media so much as a product as I do as a process. Every day people wake up and interact with it, and if everybody stopped posting on Facebook, there wouldn't be a Facebook, right? And so it's much more of a process. But Musk Musk bought Twitter because he figured out what Zuckerberg already knew, which is that if you want to control the culture, you got to control the communication infrastructure. And Zuckerberg, not for nothing, but when he hired Sheryl Sandberg, that was a clear shot across the bow that they are a political player. Joel Kaplan, for instance, was sitting behind Kavanaugh during the Kavanaugh hearings. Well-known hatchet man at Facebook that decides if policies are going to be enacted, especially on Republican politicians on the platform. There's a really great piece in Wired about Joel Kaplan that I recommend that you watch, that you listen. Well, you can listen to it or read it. The point of this is to say that you do not run a global telecoms company without having to run a lobbying arm, especially one that dismisses or cannot be harnessed by regulation globally, even as the company is making more money than most countries have. And one thing is for sure, and this journalist got to dig into this, that Chan Zuckerberg initiative has given out $5 billion with a B dollars over the last 6 years. 500 million of it went to Harvard for an AI center. We won't talk about what might have happened after that, but
did you get any of that?
I got the short end of the stick. Yeah. But and they gave 400 million to essentially get out the vote organizations to infrastructure voting. People have alleged that was for more Democratic politicians than it was for right-leaning ones, but nobody's done an evaluative study. But what I'm talking about is politics by proxy, which is to say that every dime that could have gone back into Facebook to fix its design flaws, to go into content moderation, to strike out countries that are weaponizing the platform, particularly in different countries, they could have done so much to save us from
so
it.
I think we have
all the Musk fans are leaving.
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple questions. So if anyone has questions,
there's questions.
Oh, we got some questions. Is there a mic?
I think there was a mic.
There was a mic.
I think the mic lady might have just. I think we got a mic at the back there.
This isn't being recorded, is it?
I think it is.
Gentlemen.
All right.
Gentleman
Strike
over there.
from the record.
The part about the 500 million? Or?
Delicioso.
I really appreciate the insights you're sharing with us, and the special thanks to Joan for mentioning the important work of fact.
Not on?
No, it's not on.
Sorry.
There we go. It's on now.
I tried again. Thank you very much for sharing insights, and to Joan for mentioning the important work of fact-check organizations. My name is Stefan Voss. I work for the German news agency DPA, and I'm a board member of the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. You spoke about how to hold the platforms accountable, the transparency things we're in Europe, here in Italy, and I would be interested in your attitude to the European regulation, means the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice, which also might enable journalism more to write more about platforms and hold them accountable. So what's your attitude towards this regulation process, if you have a?
Joan, do you want to?
If anyone, I have not really followed DSA that much.
Yeah,
I think any move towards regulation that can enforce transparency is good. I think it's going to have to be a pretty large market share of the corporation for them to bother meeting those transparency requests. I do have some personal problems with, unfortunately, I do believe in data privacy, and so I do not believe these corporations should be collecting as much data as they do. And so the idea that you would pass that data on then to researchers to audit the platforms, I would just like to see a little bit more nuance and regulation that would suggest that they can't collect this much data without having a right to delete, especially as I do believe the net belongs to all of us, not just the corporations, and I do think that we need better systems for the removal of data, just so we can have a little privacy as a treat.
All right. Anyone else? Is that you in the red?
Hi, my name's Neve McIntyre. I'm a reporter at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. It's a non-profit based in London. And yeah, I guess I had a question around, I think we've seen like a bit of a kind of upsurge in labour organising within platforms recently. So like with SAMA, Facebook moderators having kind of a class action against Facebook over their working conditions, or we reported a story based on Teleperformance, who was providing TikTok with content moderators.
Right.
They've won the right to unionize, and then even with this all sort of job losses for white collar workers and how that might be a kind of politicizing moment for them or whatever. And I guess I wanted to ask what you thought the role was for kind of labour organising as a strategy for kind of platform accountability, and if you have any kind of, optimism about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting about the moderators, because I've been thinking a lot about moderators recently, and particularly certain language moderators, because I told you the story about Georgia before, and also I've been doing story about TikTok in Albania recently, and clearly there's a lot of work for Albanian-speaking moderators in Albania. The app actually doesn't work in Albanian, but you can still use it if you're Albanian, so you can't actually report if you don't speak English or Italian, you can't actually report problems. But I don't necessarily have an answer to your question, but I was just interested to know about the world of Albanian moderators, because I think there's probably one or maybe two. They wouldn't tell me how many there were, and I've pushed them very hard on this. But no, it's certainly something I've been thinking about, and it's an incredibly important thing to be able to see.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that labor organization is coming to something like social media moderating, because it got very little attention for a long time, and I don't think anybody even thought about, human beings actually have to look at this stuff, which is terrible. Like, a lot of it is, I wouldn't want to look at one piece of it, let alone spend my whole day doing it. There's massive issues around. I mean, OpenAI, I think, paid Kenyans or something like that $1 to look at all sorts of terrible stuff. I think it's a good thing that there's more organization around those kind of jobs.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one more quick question.
This has got to be really good. Really good.
The pressure's on.
It's got to be the best question.
Courtney in the
In the yellow.
Yeah.
A bright yellow sweater.
So my question is, going back to the Facebook papers, we know that Timnit Gebru got fired for her work on scholastic parrots, basically the dangers of AI systems.
Two of them did.
Right, so then there was another paper that they weren't allowed to publish about how generative AI can reproduce extremist texts very quickly. So basically a lot of research coming out about the dangers of generative AI from internal research teams.
Right.
And now we see generative AI products on the market. So can you talk a little bit more about what, if any of that, was like in the Facebook papers? And then B, isn't it kind of too late for regulation? I mean, even the DSA transparency after the fact seems like really inefficient, and it's moving, again, much faster than the regulatory frameworks are. So what would you recommend, maybe each of you just quickly, in terms of especially European regulators who seem to be the only ones ready to do anything about this?
So I think we have about 2 minutes.
I mean, Congress is meeting about it, so I'm sure they're going to fix it. They're thinking deeply about it, I'm sure.
I mean, I'm sure you're absolutely right that it's going back to that thing of like this Frankenstein's monster thing of like, it's developing faster than people can understand it, and like going back to what Joan was saying about the people at Twitter not understanding how something works, but they're still rolling this technology out, and
And some pretty vocal, like there was a story, I'm trying to remember where it was now, but Google internal staffers saying, we should not release this. It's going to be bad, and it's going to do a lot of bad stuff. And Google's like, great, thanks for your feedback. Let's roll it out.
There's this amazing kind of discord that I've been noticing more and more recently between the policy people within these platforms and then the developers and I guess the marketing and press people. But like often we've had like off the record notes from people within platforms saying like, thank you for doing what you're doing. You know, it's like it's really helping us like push our agenda on during meetings, but they're very quietly saying
it's too bad someone said move fast and break things,
right,
because that became like a mantra instead of kind of, it just became, oh, it's okay to do that. That's now our guiding principle.
Well,
even if what you break is
one
democracy.
Comment, which is essentially that what we're witnessing now is not an AI arms race. Chris Gilliard is a personal friend and researcher of AI and whatnot. He described it to me on the phone the other day as an AI gold rush. And there's a lot of fool's gold out there.
Yeah.
And, Musk can, on the one hand, put out a statement saying we need an AI pause until we can evaluate the
But
risk.
he's building his own.
And he's building an LLM, most likely out of Twitter data, right? And so we have not seen the brunt of this yet, but we do know, legal teams are going to have to jump in, deal with the copyright issue. We're going to have human rights organizations dealing with the non-consensual sexual imagery that comes about. Most of deep fakes, I think 95% of them are pornographic. Many whose faces have not consented to be featured in that way. So we're at the tip of the spear, I think. With AI and social media, I feel like we're at the end. But that's to say that as these companies figure out what is profitable, which is making money off of money, we're going to move into a new era of social banking, and that's when things are going to get pretty gross.
I mean, certainly there's been...
guys, I think we are out of time.
It's gonna make
we
me
can talk
shut
about
up.
it out in the corridor.
Yeah.
Well, this was
find me
this was
outside.
fantastic. Thank
Thanks
you,
for coming.
everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks to all the panelists. Have a great.
And everybody go read the markup. Catastrophe.
As usual, things just started to get interesting.
It's a shame.
Short.
Yeah.
Please go outside because we have to sanitize.